Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Well, it looks like we're all gonna die, so that's nothing new there. I thought I'd say a few words about keeping our perspective and remembering a Dhamma principles. Certainly this situation with the coronavirus illustrates the Mai principle, uncertainty. That life is unpredictable, uncertain. Things are going to happen, and we have no way of knowing what or when. And people get upset because they have the unrealistic expectation that things can just continue in the way they're used to. And then life throws, usually it's on a more individual level. We have, various crises and tragedies and unexpected events in our own personal lives. Sometimes it's at a larger collective level. And it's not really anything out of the ordinary stream of reality. What is unrealistic, what is out of realistic expectation, is that things can continue placidly the way we've always known them, as we're used to. One of the three characteristics is anicca, change, impermanence. No set of conditions is fixed or permanent or everlasting. Things are going to be changing constantly. They're different moment to moment. And they're not always under our control. In fact, usually they're not. What we can do, what we should do, is guard our own mind states. We're responsible for our own mind states. And we should be extra diligent now to guard ourselves against falling into unskillful states like fear, despair, anxiety. We should maintain the equanimity, upekkha. This is the mental quality of not being perturbed by external factors. Maintaining steady, calm center. So whatever happens, if we're centered in that, with upekkha, and being centered in that, in the clear knowing, then we're strong. We have that central point from which we're operating that's not affected. It's not affected even by our own death. It's just the clear knowing. And you should cultivate the prime virtues of wisdom and compassion. And compassion, karuna, is the heart value of wishing to see beings relieved from their suffering. It's one of the Brahma Viharas, and it's one of the prime attributes of a Buddha, is that he's perfect in wisdom and compassion. And compassion is not the same as maudlin sort of feelings of pity. And this is what distinguishes it. Karuna, the Buddhist definition of compassion, is not vicariously taking up the suffering of others. No, it shouldn't make you feel bad. It's an effusion from the heart, wishing that beings be released from suffering. Beginning with ourselves, may I be released from suffering. It's a good meditation to take up if you find yourself succumbing to negative mind states. It's a good antidote to anger, to ill will, to despair, to fear, to rouse up that compassion and try and make it universal, apamana, boundless. Have compassion for all sentient beings without distinction, whether they're near or far, whether they are high or low, whether they are friendly to you or inimical to you. In fact, it's of special value to try and develop compassion towards those that irritate us or make us angry, cause us problems. Develop compassion towards them. And compassion can be developed as a meditation. It should also be a principle guiding our actions in our life, that our actions are coming from a place of compassion. It's a simple definition of ethics would be those actions which reduce suffering in the world. Those which increase suffering are unethical. So if compassion is guiding our actions, then it's very helpful as a motivating force. The other quality, supreme quality of the Buddha is wisdom, panya. And this is necessary to guide and balance compassion in terms of action. Compassion must be guided or moderated by wisdom. An example occurs to me that, if someone is badly ill with the coronavirus or with anything else, compassion may motivate you to want to give that person a big hug to comfort them. But wisdom says, "Oh, hold on. It's not a sensible thing to do in this situation." You know? So wisdom means that acts of compassion are going to be actually helpful and actually reduce suffering in the world. A lot of times people react from compassion without any guidance from wisdom, and they end up interfering or meddling in situations and make things worse. Very often wisdom will say that there's nothing to be done in this situation, but still the feeling of compassion should be present. When wisdom and compassion are both perfect, as in the case of a Buddha, there's no conflict. They completely inform and illuminate each other, fulfill each other. But when our wisdom and compassion are immature, incomplete, they can often seem to be at odds. It's another one of these pairs of qualities that needs to be balanced and held together. Wisdom not motivated or not informed by compassion, not infused with compassion, can be very cold and heartless. Wisdom, for example, emphasizes knowing the emptiness, the not-self nature of all phenomena and all beings. And seeing the emptiness is the supreme quality of wisdom. But that, if applied unskillfully, indiscriminately, it can lead to a kind of aloofness and unconcern. It can even be subject to abuse. The classic example of that are the Japanese samurai who studied Zen and used the principle of emptiness to say that when they chopped somebody's head off with a sword, they weren't really doing any harm. It's just empty atoms passing through empty atoms. And all was void, so what's the difference? You know? Which in some strictly technical sense, yeah, you could say, that's technically true, but it's obviously not a wise, compassionate understanding of the Dhamma. It's an abuse of the principles of Dhamma. It's devoid of this quality of compassion. The Tibetans make an interesting distinction that I think is worth contemplating. I think it has some profound meaning. They say that the principle of wisdom is female and the principle of compassion is male. And the union of the two is perfection. It's worth contemplating if for no other reason than it goes contrary to superficial stereotypes of our culture. But there is some profound truth, I think, in that way of thinking of it. With the principle of as above, so below, you take a mundane or a biological example of that is at the moment of conception when the sperm enters the egg in a mammalian species. The egg is wisdom. It has all the potential of unfolding a new life, but it's barren on its own. And the sperm is the compassion because it destroys itself to fertilize the egg. Wisdom is the universal potential, and compassion is the energizing spark. And the two of these need to be developed in in pairwise fashion. There's a dysfunction, a spiritual dysfunction, if they're out of balance. And the combination of compassion and wisdom will allow us to overcome fear and anxiety and depression, negativity. None of these are compatible with a mind that's centered and balanced and grounded in wisdom and compassion. The way to develop wisdom is by the disciplined introspection of the mind. The forms of meditation that we call broadly vipassana, looking at reality in its dispassionate, clear-sighted way. At the moment of this clear looking, at the moment of penetrating with insight, there isn't really compassion present as such at that moment, because that would cloud the clarity of the insight. But it does lead to an unfoldment of wisdom. When we understand the universal realities of dukkha, anicca, anatta, and if we see them in our own being, then we can understand by analogy their reality in other beings. And we can have compassion for the processes that they're going through by understanding the processes we're going through ourselves. By a comparison or parallel extension, we can see the same processes are going on in others. And even when other beings are acting contrary to our interests, or acting unskillfully, or even acting in inimical or hurtful ways, we can have at least compassion for them. They're going through their own suffering, their own change based on their karma. And this can lead us to have an understanding of them and then a compassion for them. It's a little bit of a digression, but there is a kind of interesting parallel with compassion and epidemic disease in the mythical history or future history of humanity. It goes through cycles, these up and down cycles, and the end of a cycle can bottom out in one of three ways, either by violence, by plague, or by famine. And it'll kill off most of the beings at the end of a cycle. This particular cycle is supposed to end with violence. And if the cycle ends in violence, it's because the defilement of ill will or dosa is predominant at that time, and most of the beings who are killed off at the end of the age will be reborn in hell because they practiced violence and cruelty. If it ends by famine, it's because the quality of greed was predominant at that time, and the beings who die at the end of a cycle that ends by famine will mostly be reborn in the ghost world because they are consumed with desire, hunger and thirst. But if a cycle ends by epidemic, It's because the defilement of ignorance was predominant. And when those beings die, they're mostly reborn in the heaven world because the presence of the epidemic rouses compassion in them as they feel compassion for those who they see suffering and ill. So it may be, even though this current situation is causing people to freak out and be stressed and kind of lose their sense of balance and proportion, uh, there is a potential for some unfolding of positive qualities. Hopefully, compassion will be increased, will be roused in people, and there might be some benefit in everybody kind of chilling out. There's a, people are supposed to stay at home, so there may be some involuntary seclusion uh, happening for people that will uh, hopefully, at least in some cases, may foster some introspection, some kind of informal meditation, going inwards rather than outwards. And it may bring home to some of the people with much dust in their eyes. It may bring forward some Dhamma reflections on the uncertainty and the impermanence of human life, and may prompt some reflections in those directions.